Committee will now come to order. We note that we do not have a quorum. However, we will take up the items as they appear on the agenda. First, we will announce that we will continue items 21 and 22 for 1 week, which puts those items on the agenda for the April 11th meeting, and we'll continue item 24 for 2 weeks, which puts that item on the agenda for the April 18th meeting. And also I'll announce that we'll hold item 2 in committee to a date undetermined. So we'll hold item 2 in committee. Next, we will take items 1 through 19. Except for item number 2, we'll hold item number 2 has already been announced that we're going to hold item 2 in committee. So we're going to take up items 1. But you know what? Let's take up item 1 first by itself, because we do have a public comment card on item 1.
I'm sorry, that's item number 2.
I'm sorry, item number 2, I announced earlier that we'll hold item 2 in committee to a date undetermined. We still need information to determine that. Okay. So we'll take up item 1. Public comment is open on item 1. We have Steve Coffroth. Yes, Steve.
Thank you. Steve Coffroth here representing AFSCME. As you know, AFSCME represents the employees at the Community Redevelopment Agency of LA. And the unfortunate circumstances is that they're being dissolved. And about 80% of those employees have now received layoff notices, and their careers are being prematurely terminated as of June 30th. We've asked a number of times, and the council and this committee have taken action in order to get reports about transferring some of those employees, including employees that can perform the housing functions that the city has adopted to take. And the city has asked for a number of reports back as early in January, and still we've heard no reports back on what is going to happen with those employees, how we're going to transition that work. And the clock is ticking for these employees. We respectfully ask that there be put urgency on these reports so that they can be completed, and so that these employees can transfer over and perform those vital functions. We have done everything we can in order to build this bridge. We have brought all the supplies, we have the talent, we have the money to pay for that talent. All we need now is permission to put our bridge on your side. And so we respectfully ask that you put some urgency behind that and come to a resolution on that item as quickly as possible, so that we can make sure that these people are not left, unfortunately, without employment, that they can continue their careers in housing and benefit the city as well. We respectfully ask that. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, on that note, over the next 2 weeks, we anticipate having that dialogue in this committee.
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll be back then.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. That's the only public comment card I have on item number 1. Is there anybody here who's here for public comment on item number 1? Seeing and hearing none, public comment on item number 1 is now closed. With that, we will receive and file this item. Next, we'll go to items 3 through 19. Okay. All right. So we're on items 3 through 19. Is there anybody here to make public comment on items 3 through 19? Seeing no public comment cards before me and seeing no one come forward, public comment is now closed on items 3 through 19. With the dissolution of the CRA of Los Angeles, we will now receive and file all of these items. Can we have the CLA read into the record item number 20?
Item number 20, LHD and CAO to report relative to authorization to release an RFP for housing-related technical services for the FY 2012-2015, and to amend 22 contracts for housing-related technical services, contracts to extend the contract terms and increase the contract amounts, and to amend a contract with David Paul Rosen and Associates to amend the scope of work and increase the contract amount and related actions.
Okay. Anybody from housing that can come forward and shed some light on this, answer some questions? Your name, please?
Good morning, Corey Smith, Los Angeles Housing Department.
Los Angeles Housing Department, thank you. With regard to David Paul Rosen, the contract, I understand the city attorney's office was reviewing this. Have they come to any conclusions?
No, they're still reviewing it.
Okay. Is there any additional points that can be given for the local preference?
This was a contract, actually, a bid for the ones we received, the bids we received back in 2009. So it was, the contract that was selected at that time could no longer perform, so we went to the next two, and this is one of the ones in the next two that bid at that time.
So being that the local preference is something that was enacted before, after 2009, so the local preference points are not applicable here, or?
Well, it just wasn't, we're not at a bid process now. With the new RFP and everything, we'll be doing the local preference and all.
Okay. So the funding for these services comes from what source?
The funding for David Rosen contracts is from home funds.
So the amendments seem to be regarding extending the deadline for the work?
Yes, for the remainder of this year, to have the technical services available for the remainder of this year.
Okay. And the main reason for extending the deadline and the contracts and the amounts is for what?
To perform all of the housing duties that for the remainder of 2012, and it would be the third year of this go-around of this RFP process.
If I may, Mr. Chair, Rushmore Cervantes with the Housing Department. As it relates to the David Rosen contract, we utilize that specific contract requesting an increase in the dollar amount to assist the department analyzing the CRA or the former CRA, putting together the analysis of the projects that were in the pipeline. So that's the reason why we asked for that additional allocation.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I don't have any further questions. Is there anybody here from the public to speak on item 20? I do not have any public comment cards before me on item 20. Okay, seeing no one come forward, I don't have any public comment cards. Public comment on item 20 is now closed. So it's a recommendation of the chair that we move the CAO report. Okay. That moves us to our next item. Thank you. Item 23. Can you please read it into the record?
Item number 23, LHD and CLA to report relative to rules, regulations, and/or practices related to restricting relatives of any person who has invested in, developed, or managed city-subsidized housing from living in a unit within the aforementioned housing development. And then the CLA's office will not be releasing a report on this item.
Good morning. Once again, Rushmore Cervantes with the Housing Department. I'm joined by Todd Leong with the City Attorney's Office that helped the department craft the report before you. Currently, there are no provisions that prohibit relatives of developers from occupying affordable units within structures that were financed with federal funds. It must be noted that any individual that may be related at this point would still have to qualify relative to income restrictions. So they would qualify either way. But obviously there's some concerns as to appearance, as to what that would look like by having a developer having relatives that would occupy an affordable housing complex. Currently, the City Housing Department utilizes federal home guidelines as it relates to ethics, and that's primarily right now crafted around the subcontracting or contracting to ensure that there are no relatives associated with subcontracting, whether it be from the president or anyone down the line within the organization. And there are exceptions, but those exceptions must be clearly approved prior to execution. So those are in place right now. But what the department now, working with the City Attorney's Office, has provided some recommendations for the council to proceed forward that could incorporate both the same stringent guidelines relative to restricting residents being relatives, and hold not only the developer accountable, but also the tenants accountable by having the tenants sign an affidavit indicating they're not related to anyone within the developer or anyone related to that constructed the project, but also then hold the developer accountable as well. So we also expanded the actual definition of family to include and or adopted, and it's just expanded to be as broad as possible so that we have a broad net to be able to cover anyone, so that we don't have any issues relative to appearance. There would be, on a case-by-case basis, an opportunity to approve that. The developers, as we provided in the guidelines before you, would have to request the approval prior to allowing any individual to occupy the facility. But we provided that as an option, and again, there are punitive damage up to $5,000 if the developer does know, in fact, to have a relative within an affordable housing unit without prior notice to the City of LA, and would also result in the immediate eviction of the tenant if they had signed an affidavit indicating they were not related. So we have that for consideration of this committee and council.
So the last portion
Yes.
of what you just described, that's already in place, or?
No, it is not. That's what we're proposing now. The only thing we have in place right now is...
Meaning that we develop language to clarify that both the developer and the tenant would basically sign underneath many clauses, including an additional clause that clarifies whether or not they're related to the developer.
That's correct.
In addition to that, I think it's important for that clause to be written in a way that is in plain English. For example, I have a question. If a person is related to a board member, therefore, are they related to the developer? It's a question.
That's good. I'm not certain I have the answer to that, Councilman.
Because what happens is many times people see the developer as the vested owner, the private developer. However, there might be a not-for-profit that has board members, and board members of that not-for-profit may be related to someone who wants to live in that affordable unit. And for example, the most famous situation recently was with New Economics for Women, correct?
Correct.
And then what was the name of the board member that was, her name was bantered about, and obviously I don't want to say that she was guilty unless
Ms. Stotzer.
something's been conclusive, but I mean, it was all over the TV and all over the LA Times, and it came up in this committee and on the floor of the council and everywhere else. So that's an example where B. Stotzer, what was her position with the organization?
She was the president of New Economics for Women.
So B. Stotzer was the president of New Economics for Women, and apparently there were relatives, aunts, uncles, sons, daughters who seemed to be living in a unit or units related to B. Stotzer in the New Economics for Women development.
That's correct.
It was what supposed relative lived there? Was it an aunt, an uncle, a parent?
From what we gathered from the story, Councilman, was that she had two of her sons living in one of the developments that had been financed with federal funds. What I also understand is that there were both a combination of fair market rental units as well as affordable housing units, and the two sons were living in the fair market rental units. But obviously the appearance is bad enough, and that's, of course, I think the purpose of this motion before us, to ensure that we're able to reserve the right to provide the affordable housing units to those that are most needy and not having conflicts of interest, and that's why we have this before you.
And also, one thing that we need to understand as well is that clause going to clarify that when they sign, that they're saying that they showed no preference, right? Because sometimes these lists of waiting lists are very long. Sometimes over 1,000 people are waiting to be called to say, a unit has come available, are you still interested, right? Putting people at the top of the list, is that something that the City of Los Angeles, it's a policy decision, is that something that the City of Los Angeles should put up with, or just say, well, it's water under the bridge, it doesn't matter?
Part of the pre-approval process, again, when we put in this language that requires the developer to request approval prior to allowing any relative to reside in one of these affordable units, would be that the department would ask about their waiting list and to ensure that this individual was given no preference whatsoever.
So, for example, in the B. Stotzer case, the questions are, was there preference, correct? To those relatives?
That was what was implied.
And then secondly, was it disclosed anywhere?
No.
That's another thing. And then third, were or were not the other board members aware?
Well, by virtue of non-disclosure, I'm certain that nobody knew until that report came out.
Well, it certainly is very likely that nobody could identify that when they knew and how they knew, because it probably wasn't written anywhere.
That's correct.
Maybe somebody knew verbally, but that doesn't
Right.
usually hold up in court.
Right.
Uh,
Well,
so-
the intent for this is to have as broad a reaching impact to ensure that it covers anyone that would be associated with the development of the project, whether it be board members, president, CEO, all the way down within the organization, and that they, again, under a penalty, if they don't honor this proposed ordinance, would be fined.
Now, the language that you're recommending, is it in the direction of the person not being allowed to live in one of these affordable units if
No.
they're a relative?
It's
Or just
disclosure.
disclosing it,
It's
and therefore having a third party / somebody at the city of Los Angeles who would actually review it and then actually get back to that developer and let them know everything seems okay, or
That is
we
correct.
don't approve of you leasing out that unit to that person under these circumstances?
That's exactly what it would be, Councilman. It's full disclosure to enable the city to vet this and ensure that this individual or individuals were not given any preferential treatment of anyone else that was in the queue waiting to reside in one of those affordable units.
So in the B. Stotzer situation with New Economics for Women, as far as we can tell, there was no written disclosures voluntarily, because obviously back then, there wasn't any strict requirement that B. Stotzer and or her family members or New Economics for Women were required to disclose.
Right. There were no provisions at that point.
Okay. So it appears that maybe, so based on the fact that it was not required that it be disclosed, could there have been some violation of some sort? Even though there wasn't a disclosure?
No, there really could not have been. If those two individuals that happen to be her sons had occupied an affordable housing unit or affordable housing units and did not meet the income requirements, then that would have been the violation. But beyond that, the federal guidelines don't stipulate to relatives.
So there was no rule that says you can't, as a developer or a decision maker as a decision maker of the property owners and a relative, there was not, and nor are we saying that we should go in a direction where they can't occupy a unit.
Right.
We're not going to discriminate. So if there's for example, some boards require, some not-for-profit boards who are part owners of these facilities, some of them require that they have low-income individuals on the board, people from the community,
Right.
low-income individuals. That's a qualifier for actually being on the board. There's slots on the board.
Correct.
So therefore, we're not going to discriminate against a low-income family because their mom or their aunt happens to be on the board, and they happen to have a son or a daughter or a close relative who's also economically disadvantaged, who truly does qualify. We're not saying that we want to disqualify people because they have a family member who's related, who has some authority and or position with the ownership.
Right. It's a good point. It's just to make clear that this proposal is not intended to, in any way, shape, or form, discriminate one way or another. This is merely to provide full disclosure to ensure that there's equal access.
Okay. Well, I think it's important that we be very, we're not worried about how much space we're taking on the disclosure part. I think that we should break it down in plain English, and we need to clarify who qualifies as a potential conflicted individual by describing relative to what degree. I mean, a third cousin, is that considered a relative? In most cases, it's not.
Right.
It's more immediate than that. In addition to that, I think that it's important for people to understand what their legal position is. If they're a board member and they're a not-for-profit and they're not getting compensated as a board member, some people assume that there is no conflict. But what they forget is, like in the B. Stotzer case, she was a board member. Oh, wait a minute, in her case, I think she was both a board member and a paid executive director or something like that.
That's my understanding.
I guess bad example. Anyway, there's another example where somebody, it's a not-for-profit, they're volunteering their time, they're not being compensated, and then they think that there's no conflict. If their son or daughter rents out a unit, and say they do qualify, based on their income, but there is, a lot of people don't realize, just because they're not being compensated, it doesn't negate the fact that they are in fact a decision maker for part of the decision-making body for that organization, even though they're not monetarily being compensated. Their
Right.
authority still is the last authority. They make or break decisions for the organization. So I think it's important that, once again, that it be done in plain English, and that it clarify that even though an interested party, such as who's part of the ownership of the property, the development, just because they're not being financially compensated, if they have authority making, if they're in an authority and decision-making position, then they need to sign that disclosure, clarifying that they are not related or they are related to that person.
Absolutely, sir.
Okay. Like I said, don't worry too much about how much space you're taking, but at the same time, we don't want to have a 3-page disclosure that's done in a way where only an attorney can interpret exactly what it means. Okay? Anything else you'd like to add?
Nope.
Okay. Thank you. So I move that we adopt the LAHD report and direct the CLA to provide a report on this item prior to council hearing the item, and that'll be the recommendation of the chair. Next, we go to item,
We've already continued the last item.
what's that?
You've already continued the last item.
Okay, so the last
Last
item
one.
was continued. So that concludes all the items on the agenda,
And
correct?
just, but I know you indicated, but so the record reflects since there's no quorum, that all actions of the commit are communications from the chair.
Yes. Okay, these are all actions today are communications from the chair. Is anybody here for general public comment? Seeing and hearing no one come forward on general public comment, there's no general public comment cards before me. General public comment is now closed. This committee is now adjourned.